Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we're doing another Historia Civilis video. Last week we learned about Philip II, and today we're learning about Macedonian battle tactics. So I guess a more general video on Macedonia. If you guys are interested in exclusive Historia Civilis reactions, please check out the Patreon, which is linked down below. And aside from that, I am ready to jump right into this video, so let's get started.
Geopolitically, Alexander the Great was born on third base. Before he ascended to the throne, his father, Philip, had already achieved the impossible by extending Macedonian influence over the entire Greek peninsula.
Right, as we sort of talked about a little bit last week. Or not last week, sorry, last video.
And his father's influence didn't stop at geopolitics. Philip spent his entire career working to improve the Macedonian military. When Philip died, Alexander inherited the finest army on the planet.
Yeah, it's kind of like a Frederick the Great and his father's situation. You know, his dad sort of built up the empire, built up the military, and then Frederick used it to take Prussia to a height it had never been seen before. Philip II sort of built up the military and built up the empire, and then Alexander took it to new lengths. Of course, obviously, Alexander's conquests were far more extensive than Frederick the Great, but, you know, it's sort of making a comparison.
So let's talk about the Macedonian military. There's no better place to start than with their cavalry. The Macedonians called their cavalry the companions, or the companion cavalry.
Cool.
During this period, most Western armies had a really narrow conception of the proper use of cavalry. Many trained them to harass the enemy by throwing javelins or shooting arrows. Others used them as scouts or skirmishers. But beyond that, their use was limited. The Macedonians ignored this conventional wisdom. The companion cavalry specialized in charging the enemy flanks and inflicting massive casualties up close with their swords and spears.
Smart.
Despite what the movies may tell you, this was rare in the ancient world. You could even say that it was unintuitive. Stirrups hadn't been invented yet, and many people, including the Macedonians, didn't even use saddles.
Wow.
A person could get knocked off their horse by a stiff breeze. To many, charging straight into a mass of humanity seemed suicidal. But the Macedonians knew what they were doing. For instance, the spears they used were quite interesting. They were made to be as light and as thin as possible, so thin that the wooden spear wobbled as they charged. They were about 12 feet long and were held near the center. Both ends of the spear had metal tips, so if one end broke, all the rider had to do was flip the spear around and continue fighting with the other end. If that end broke as well, they had a sword to use as backup.
I guess it's good that they were double-ended, because with a spear that long and thin, seems like it could break off fairly easily. And of course the strategy of using the cavalry to flank, that would become very commonplace, so I suppose it was perhaps popularized by the Macedonians.
Obviously, these spears weren't designed to crash into the enemy line. That would have shattered the spear and knocked the rider off the horse.
Right.
The spear was designed to make lightning-quick stabs while on the move. This was hard to do, but the companions were expertly trained and were quite deadly with them. So all of this made the companions pretty distinct in the ancient world, but they also organized themselves in a strange way. When they charged, they didn't do it in a line like you'd think. They charged as a wedge. There's a reason for this. When cavalry charges in a line, they have a tendency to do this.
Right.
When the Macedonian wedges charged, they could do this. Here's why. The person at the tip of the wedge was the guy in charge. Since everyone could keep an eye on their leader, the entire unit could basically receive orders non-verbally.
Right. It's a far more precise way of organizing the unit. You all have a point to follow. You're not going to end up unintentionally spreading out, which therefore, dilutes your efforts. You can I mean, like a spear, it's pointed at the tip. You can, hit right through an enemy line. It makes sense.
This meant that they could wordlessly change directions mid-gallop, or specifically target vulnerable enemy units with surgical accuracy.
Yeah, smart.
When they made contact with the enemy, any opening made by the riders at the front could immediately be exploited by the riders further back.
Yeah.
As a result, the wedges were capable of creating chaos and cutting deep into the enemy line. A well-timed charge like this could single-handedly win a battle. But no matter how successful the cavalry were, the opportunities they created needed to be followed up by infantry. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For this to make sense, we need a rock-solid understanding of what a phalanx was.
Yes.
If we're talking phalanx...
Familiar word. I think it's a certain way of organizing your infantry, perhaps. We're about to learn, but this is a familiar term to me.
We're talking spears. Dudes holding spears maybe 8 feet long, with big circular shields. A phalanx was a group of these spearmen organized into a tight square.
Right.
In battle, they presented a solid shield wall, bristling with spears. Since there were so many people packed into the square, and everybody in the square was so well trained, the phalanxes had an intense forward momentum. Against less disciplined opponents, they were nearly unstoppable. But they had vulnerabilities. They were slow as hell, both slow to move and slow to turn. Plus, since the entire phalanx had to work together, they were pretty bad at fighting in 2 directions at once.
Right.
This made them vulnerable to flanking maneuvers. When 2 opposing phalanxes met on the battlefield, the 2 squares would lock shields and push against each other as hard as they could. This would basically take both of the phalanxes out of commission for a while, and the shoving would continue until one side lost their footing, or another group showed up to tip the balance. Phalanxes were all the rage in Greece. For the century or 2 preceding Philip's reign, the entire peninsula was basically going through one giant phalanx arms race. For the longest time, Macedon didn't have phalanxes. The Macedonians were able to survive on the strength of their excellent cavalry, but the infantry side of things was kind of ignored. When Philip came to power, he busied himself with a bunch of reforms and introduced phalanxes to Macedon. He gave these new units a new prestigious name, the Foot Companions.
I love that. You've got the companions, the cavalry. What shall we call these new phalanxes? How about the Foot Companions? I mean, it's less cool, but it's still pretty cool. I mean, yeah, I'm a companion. That's pretty cool.
Through Philip's leadership, they would become the backbone of the Macedonian army. The Foot Companions were modeled after the Greek phalanx, but were new and improved. They used a new kind of spear called the sarissa. Technically, sarisses might be pikes rather than spears, but whatever. Let's not be sticklers to detail. This weapon was usually 14 or 18 or sometimes even 20 feet long.
Oh my god.
It was basically twice as long as the spears they used in Greece.
Jeez.
So what did this mean? Well, if you can picture 2 phalanxes marching at each other, the one with the longer spears would always draw first blood.
I mean, it's kind of funny and, I guess very obvious to think about, but I mean, yeah, it's true. I mean, you have a longer spear, you're gonna hit first. Although it is kind of somewhat amusing to think of a wall of guys with 20-foot spears just poking them out way ahead of them. But I suppose if it works, right?
And would therefore have the advantage. Plus, the sarissas were so long that people 3 or 4 or 5 rows back could still reach the enemy with their spears.
Wow.
If you compare this with the Greek phalanx, the Macedonians were able to get double or triple the number of spears attacking at once, with no additional manpower. But the sarissas came with a downside. They were absurdly long, and it took an equally absurd amount of training to be able to use them effectively.
Yeah, I feel like that would be very unwieldy, because you're holding maybe a foot or 2 of spear. You've got 16 to 18 feet of spear ahead of you. That's not very easy to move around and use, you know what I mean? Plus, would probably be very wobbly, so not the most mobile weapon.
Unlike normal spears, the sarissas had to be held with both hands. To accommodate this, the Macedonians shrunk down their shields and made them into tiny 18-inch bucklers, which could be strapped to each man's upper arm and used to deflect incoming spears. To get the untrained Macedonian infantry comfortable with this new weapon, they had to be drilled and drilled and drilled at a huge cost.
Yeah.
But in the end, it was worth it. Once they were in the field, the foot companions were basically elite phalanxes, better trained and better equipped than their Greek counterparts. But all of the training in the world couldn't change the fact that it was incredibly hard for all phalanxes, including these new foot companions, to respond quickly to a changing battlefield.
Right.
They still had all of the weaknesses of a normal phalanx. They were still slow, and still vulnerable to getting flanked. When a bunch of phalanxes were lined up, the units at each end of the line were exposed. Here, Philip placed a new kind of infantry, called the shield bearers. The shield bearers were outfitted in a much more traditional Greek style, with a shorter, more manageable spear and a large shield. They also carried swords. Since they weren't weighed down with the giant unwieldy sarissa, the shield bearers were much more versatile than the foot companions. They were the Macedonian army's utility players. They could fight as a regular phalanx, or they could spread out. They could quickly redeploy on the battlefield, or totally break formation and charge.
Very useful.
They could fight with a spear or with a sword. If you ever hear about the Macedonians doing anything weird, like fighting on uneven ground, or breaching walls, or scaling cliffs, it was the shield bearers who did it. These units were entirely made up of veteran soldiers, men with long and distinguished careers.
These are your best fellas. You know, this is perhaps a small amount of men compared to the rest of your infantry, but if there's a job to be done, they're going to get it done. I mean, you definitely need that in your army, especially if your other infantry are a little less mobile.
Plucked from the foot companions and given a place of honor on the flanks.
Right.
Under normal circumstances, these units were supposed to hold back and leave the intense fighting to the foot companions. The shield bearers were kind of like a reserve force, except Philip's innovation was to put his reserves on the exposed flanks, which is kinda genius. When the enemy line began to falter, the shield bearers were sent in. They could move much faster than the foot companions, and their looser way of fighting was better for dealing with a retreating enemy. Now all of the pieces are in place. Let's see how they worked together. The most well-known Macedonian tactic is called the hammer and anvil. You may have heard of this. It's super famous. With the hammer and anvil, it was the infantry's job, in this case the foot companions, to engage the enemy and hold them in place.
Right.
They were the anvil. It was the cavalry's job to swing around and attack the enemy from behind. They were the hammer. The whole thing relied on the speed and effectiveness of the hammer, and the reliability of the anvil.
Of course, and as we've seen throughout this video, the infantry is set up to be that anvil, to hold strong, and the cavalry, Philip is using them to do quick, precise strikes, so they're set up to be the hammer, which is obviously why this works so well, because they've been perfectly trained to do exactly what they need to do.
The whole point of this tactic was to quickly envelop the enemy and force them to face attacks from two directions at once. If the enemy wanted to break the encirclement, they either had to go through the foot companions, who were basically one giant unstoppable meat grinder, or go through the companion cavalry, who happened to be one of the most effective cavalry units in human history.
Yeah.
It's simple, but it's extremely effective. Hannibal at the Battle of Cannae used this tactic against the Romans with astounding success, but we'll cover other famous examples in the near future.
Hey, a simple strategy, but like I said, if it works, it works. You know, sometimes you don't need to get super fancy. If you can simply outmaneuver your enemy in a simple way, there you go. You've got it. That's all you need.
Before Philip's reign, Macedon did not have reliable infantry. They were able to get by because of their excellent cavalry, but nobody ever bothered to invest the time and money to bring the infantry up to the Greek standard. Philip changed this. Through his leadership, he not only met the Greek standard, but exceeded it. At the time of his death, Macedon was still a regional power, but thanks to Philip, it could now field a world-class army.
I was gonna let the ending song play a little bit. That was a great video. I'm very excited to get into Alexander, which will be, I believe, the next video after this one. I made this comparison earlier, but what Historia Civilis was saying at the end remind me of Prussia again. You know, Frederick the Great's father leaves him with a regional power and a world-class military, which Frederick takes and expands. So we're going to get to see Alexander do that with what his father has left him, and he's going to create one of the greatest empires of all time. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I certainly did. Please check out the Patreon, and I will see you guys again next time.